couple more points about this Lorenz curve. It's got to be having an increasing slope as you go left to right. Why is that the case? Why must the slope of the Lorenz curve be increasing as you move left to right? You can see it's getting steeper. It's like if you're climbing a mountain, like this is the nice part, and then it gets, every step is getting worse, right? It's harder and harder to climb. Why is that? It's cumulative, and by definition, we're lining people up here from 0 to 100% by income levels. So these guys have to be the poorest, and then they have to be getting richer as you move left to right. Right? So if it's ever like kind of dips and then goes like that, then you line them up wrong. That means you lined up a rich guy left of a poor guy, and so your curve kind of went up like this, and then came back down. You know, or flattened out. It can't ever come back down. First of all, because it's cumulative. So. But it could, it could kind of like have an S shape. But then it means you line them up wrong. It has to have this sort of convex shape, Lorenz curve. And it can also not go above this dotted line, or else again you line people up wrong. How could the poorest 10% have 30% of the income? By definition, they're not the poorest 10% then. So that's a couple of points there. You can't have anything above that 45-degree line. Okay. And then, so a couple possible questions about the Gini coefficient. Pre-tax and transfer versus post-tax and transfer, right? So, under which scenario do you think the Gini coefficient is probably bigger? Pre or post?
Usually pre.
Usually pre. Why is that?
Well, with the practice problem, most tax and transfer programs are going to reduce income inequality.
Right, so it's because most of these programs, whether it's a marginal tax rate that rises over time, you're taking a bigger percentage of money from the wealthy and a lesser percentage from the poor, and conceivably you're giving welfare programs to the poor. So people getting cash from the government paid less to the government, and the people who are giving cash to the government are the wealthier people. So you're probably reducing inequality there. And then this is an important point to make as well, which people had trouble with a little bit on the problem set. Remembering that the tax and transfer system will, by definition, affect pre-tax income. So a big theme in this class is that policies change people's behavior pre the policy kicking in. So, a tax system that exists, like when you're 16, you haven't had a job yet, your choice of what you're going to do with your career is arguably affected by the tax system that exists in the country that you're in, even though you haven't been affected by that system yet. Right? But it still matters what kind of country you're in. Like if we taxed all income above $100,000, a lot more people, like at 100%, I'm sure a lot more people would think about maybe being a teacher, because they're like, why should I try to be a CEO? You're just going to take all my money above $100,000 anyway. Right? So that might affect people's decisions, even though they choose to not be affected by them. Right? So it's a sort of like cyclical thing. We even see that with the macro effect stuff. Right, that like changing government spending has a cyclical effect. So you also want to think about policies, changing people's behavior, which then changes how much they interact with the policy and so on. Same thing with rent seeking, right? It's kind of like people respond to something in advance, knowing what the system is going to be, so they can change the system. And so there's like a lot of kind of those cyclical, and that's kind of one mental image you have. I think that's helpful for like the qualitative questions, which as you've seen on past exams, is more part of this class than last semester. And that's why this discussion is a little more qualitative in nature, because you have to prepare yourself to be able to write something qualitative, because that's much more a part of this course. Okay, and then this is a very important point as well, and another kind of question thing we could ask you about, which is the Gini coefficient doesn't tell you about welfare, right? So the important mental image here is if we all had $1 in our bank account, that by the Gini coefficient is Gini coefficient would be 1, would be 0, excuse me, total equality. But all of us would be really unhappy about it. Social welfare would be really low. So perfect equality does not mean like it's just good, right? Because the size of the pie that we're all sharing matters, right? So you can imagine we have a pie the size of this room, and it's kind of unequally shared, but we all get a lot of pie, right? Versus like a tiny little pie that we each get an equal piece of. Like that kind of doesn't sound good because we did not get very much pie. It may be the case that with a huge pie, even if it's unequally shared, everyone gets a piece of pie that's bigger than the tiny pie would have been, right? So that's still something that we have to think about. And so don't mistake the Gini coefficient as a measure of perfect goodness. And I like to think about sort of we have efficiency and equity here. Efficiency on one side, equity on the other. And to some extent, the Gini coefficient is a measure of just pure measure of equity. and, oh, sorry, it's not visible. The Gini coefficient, in some sense, is a measure of pure equity, and sort of the Caldor-Hicks criterion is like a measure of pure efficiency, right? And deadweight loss and kind of these kind of things are all sort of on the efficiency side, right? But then there's like this stuff in the middle, right? Is like social welfare. And that depends on the utility functions and all that, like who's getting what percentage, etc. That's like the real world. It's like all in here, right? These are just nice measures of other things, right? These are pure efficiency measures. These are pure equity measures. In here is where it starts being like, well, what's the utility function? How much is each person getting? What does their utility function look like? What's the distribution? What's the size of the pie? How much does each person get? That's when you get into those discussions, and that's really where most conversations are at. But they use these measures because they're helpful as sort of benchmarks to position yourself in this space. Okay, let's keep moving here. So we talked about income mobility, sort of why it's important, and the Poom hypothesis, right? The idea that if you think you're going to get wealthy later, you think you're more likely to get rich in the future, you might not want redistribution because you don't want your money to be taken away when you do get wealthy. And so you want to think about that. I think the problem from the problem set is a nice one to review those concepts. So I won't go into too much detail here. There's a whole lecture here that I've just put into one bullet. Explanations for inequalities and consequences for them. Just her notes are very good on that lecture, so I would highly recommend just review the lecture notes number 5. It doesn't really make sense to cover it here. It's got various papers and graphs that she's presented and things like that. So take a look at those on your own as well. The next sort of big thing that we talked about was this consumption leisure budget line model. Right? And we talked about that sort of early, and we talked about it again later. So, but I would try to put all that material under one heading here. The first category here is income and substitution effects. So I wanted to give you sort of a visual to help think about how that applies in this context. So let's take a look at the visual here. Right, so we have consumption on the y-axis, leisure on the x-axis. Right? And the idea being that when we're thinking about working and earning money, trade-off that you're facing is, I could stay at home and earn nothing and get to hang out. And I like hanging out and leisure. So that's a good thing. That's one option I have. The other option I have is to go to work, which I don't really like, but I can buy stuff then because I can earn money. Right? So that's another good. Right? So the two goods are buying stuff and hanging around at home. And we get this budget line as a result of that. And the budget line has a slope equal to your wage. There's a minus sign in front of it, but it's your wage. Why is it your wage? Well, remember the definition of the slope is rise over run. And a run of 1 hour is associated with a rise of the slope. But what is a run of 1 hour? What are we talking about? We're talking about working 1 additional hour as we move right to left here. This is working an hour. Right? And then how much more money do we get from working that hour? Well, that by definition is your wage. So the slope of this is by definition your wage, or negative your wage, downward sloping line. So the slope is minus W. And this slope can change if there's like a welfare program or there's EITC or something like that, right? Because what this is actually measuring is your wage, but it's also like your effective wage. It's really saying, if I work another hour, how much more money do I have? And we all know that that's not your wage, right? So I think if people like kind of taking like campus jobs or whatever, and it's like $12 an hour, you know when you work an hour, you don't get $12, right? You get $12 minus taxes and stuff. So that is what that number, what you actually get for the hour of work, should be the slope of this line. Right? It's actually how much more can you consume in terms of dollars for working an hour. And that's a really important thing to have in your mind, because what if the slope was flatter? What does that mean? It means that you're getting less. Right? A flatter slope, like if the budget line was to have this slope instead of the steeper one, by definition means that this person, by working another hour, gets less money than this person does for working an additional hour. Even though they're, if this was literally that person's line, this person's much higher level of income than this person. But still, on the margin, working another hour, they're going to get less for that hour. So the slope matters, and the slope will tell you the substitution effect. That's kind of the key takeaway point. A steeper slope here means that the substitution effect is what? Pushing you towards more leisure or less? Why less?
Because for every hour of leisure, you're losing more juice.
Right, so here we go. Steeper slope means leisure is getting more expensive. Right? Leisure is, the cost of leisure is your wage, price of leisure. So a steeper slope means leisure is getting more expensive, right? Which means that you don't want as much leisure, you want more consumption. And that's, have you ever had that logic where you're like, oh, I got a raise in my hourly wage, I should go to work more. That feeling that you have is the substitution effect predominantly. I should go to work more. Why do I know it's a substitution effect? Because there's also an income effect, which is that like, wow, if I keep working the number of hours I was working before, I now get more money. And having more money makes me feel richer, so I just want more of everything. And everything here is consumption and leisure. So how can the income effect make you get more consumption and more leisure here? Your wages go up, and you want more consumption and more leisure. How can you get both of those? More of both.
So it's, you work maybe a little bit less than you did before, but that wage rate that pushes you beyond the consumption you had before.
Right, exactly. So you can get both by just cutting back your hours like 1 hour, but the wage increase was so much per hour that you still get more to buy more stuff. Right? So, you can go to the extreme to kind of see how the income effect would work. If your wage went up to $1 billion an hour, you'd be working less, you'd be leisuring more, and you'd be buying more stuff, right? Because the income effect would be so powerful there. Right? So you can kind of see the logic of why the income effect is pushing you towards both, and why that's reasonable with that kind of crazy example. But anyway, so the slope is about the substitution effect. Steeper means you're substituting away from leisure towards consumption. Flatter means you substitute in the other direction, towards more leisure. Right? So that's half the story. The other half of the story is the income effect. And that's going to be about where are you relative to your old budget line. So with the EITC, for example, the new budget line is, if anything, it's to the right of the old budget line. Right? We add that little funny looking thing, trapezoid on top of the old budget line. Anybody who's affected by EITC or gets an EITC payment has a positive income effect. There's no negative income effect from the EITC. Because even if you're not affected by the program, well, I'm not taking money from you. Right? I'm just giving money to people at the bottom. So that's an important point. Income effect, EITC, or EITC welfare, all this is always positive. Because the income effect is, am I richer or poorer? If you're getting a check from the government, you're richer. Period. Even if it's changing your marginal rate, changing your slope, there's a phase out, it doesn't matter. That part where it gets flatter is above your old line. You're better off, you're at a point which you never could have been at before. So you have more money. Yeah.
So you're probably noticed with the labor supply, why is it that decreases? Is that just kind of just explain that you have like more money than you can last?
Right, so how could labor supply decrease with like an EITC or something? Right? Because there's two effects. There's the income effect and the substitution effect. The income effect says, I have more money. I want more consumption and more leisure. More leisure means less work. So the income effect is always pushing you to work less because you're getting more money. You're becoming richer and you want more leisure. Wanting more leisure means wanting to work less. So income effect always pushes you to work less here with these welfare effects. The substitution effect is going to be about, depending on, is the slope steeper than it used to be or is it flatter than it used to be? And that could be one, that could push you one way or the other. But if the income effect is more powerful than the substitution effect, then it won't matter. Any policy is going to make you want to work less. Right? The only one instance with the EITC, actually we'll come to the EITC in a bit, but with the sample problem. We'll talk about when we have numbers to talk about. So I'll hold off on, I'll bring that back, but remind you if I don't bring it back. There's some instances where you don't have an income effect with the EITC. Specifically, if you're not working right now, then if you continue to do that, under the EITC, you don't get any money. So there's no income effect until you start working. And so that actually will push you to want to work more. But we'll come back to talking about that. So I outlined in a bit more detail like the income substitution effect with some text, so you guys can kind of conceptualize what's going on. So take a look at those. I won't talk too much about all these things. It's just kind of summarizing EITC and welfare. That's because that's one of the two sample problems that I wanted to do. One about elasticity of taxable income and stuff, and then playing around with some examples of this. And then the final thing was the macro effects of fiscal policy. I want to make a couple points about that. We've only spent one day on that, so I really don't think it's likely that you'll get a long question on macro effects, like long, because we really haven't had a problem set question about it. But I have no idea. It's fair game, but I just don't think there's enough there to talk about. If the idea there is, and I recommend it just for time, time purposes, again, since we did this in great detail in the review, you can go to the review and take a look at like the logic of how to walk through the math. The review video was posted today from last Friday, so you can take a look at that and see the logic of how to compute these government spending and tax multipliers. But you want to be able to talk about what's going on, so I'll try to give you like a mental image of what's going on and what is it multiplier, why does it happen right now. And then you want to be able to understand, like, you want to know the formula for each of these. So that's important. The government spending multiplier, what is the government spending multiplier? Does somebody remember? 1 over 1 minus MPC. What about the tax multiplier? Right, minus MPC over 1 minus MPC. Right. So how do we compute the effect of fiscal policy? Well, we have to figure out what kind of, is it an increase in government spending? Is it a decrease in government spending? Is it an increase in taxes or a decrease in taxes? Those are the 4 things you would be doing. So figure out which it is. Is it a tax thing or is it a spending thing? And then is it an up or a down? And how much up or down? So if government spending goes up by $1 million, how would we compute the effect of that on GDP? You say, look, government spending went up by $1 million. So government spending up $1 million. I have to then multiply that by the government spending multiplier. That's why it's called a multiplier, right? You multiply it by what you just did. And what you did was, G went up by $1 million. So when G goes up by $1 million, you take $1 million, positive $1 million, because it's an increase in government spending, and multiply it by the government spending multiplier, 1 over 1 minus MPC. The result of that is the effect of $1 million increase in government spending on GDP. So that's, remember why it's called a multiplier. You're just multiplying whatever this number is, or whatever this number is, by what you did. And what you did is you either raised taxes or government spending, which would be a plus sign for what you did, and a minus sign would be if you lowered government spending or lowered taxes.
Here, I can see this in negative 0.6. It would, for the tax multiplier, would be positive 0.6 divided by that 1
Right.
minus.
So can your MPC be negative?
No.
The lowest you can be is 0. Like if I give you $1, you can't, like, you either will consume, you either will increase your spending by 0 or somewhere between 0 and 1. You can't be like, since you gave me $1, I now want to save much, like more than $1 because of that. It's possible that's true for some people, but on average in society, that's not going to be the case. If everyone gets $1, consumption on average is going to go up.
It's not really there.
It's not really, because it would have to be literally, I give you $1 and you start buying less things, which is sort of odd. Like how, you know, like, it would be a very weird response to getting a check. Is that you're going to buy less things than you would have if you hadn't gotten a check. Which is kind of saying that like every good is inferior, kind of, which is not really possible. So kind of, we're defining consumption as like everything, right? So you have to, that has to go up. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so that's the first point. You want to be able to talk about the role of MPC. Like, why does MPC matter? Well, that actually ties back to what the multipliers even are saying, right? What is a multiplier? Well, I'll just go with a simple an example here. Like Sylvia owns like a bridge building company, right? And I'm the government. And I come up to Sylvia and I'm like, look, we passed this bill, we're going to increase government spending, right? And we can ignore the tax side of it. We're getting that money from, like, it's magic, right? So just assume that is true for now. I'm not saying that economists actually do this, but just for our purposes, we're going to hold taxes constant, which is actually kind of reasonable. You know, the bill is passed and it's not always matched with tax increases to pay for it. Sometimes it's just like, well, we'll figure it out. Right? So anyway, we're going to go to Sylvia and kind of like a stimulus and be like, we're going to spend $1 million. We're going to have you build some bridges for us in Cambridge. That's like a stimulus policy. All right, so Sylvia gets $1 million. And let's say that everyone in society here, you're all society, everyone in society has an MPC of 0.7. Right, so we're kind of doing like a mini sample problem here. Right? Government spending goes up by $1 million. This is the kind of question I can see them asking. Government spending is going to increase by $1 million. Right? And the question is sort of what is the effect? And like what's the logic of the effect, right? What's going on here? MPC for everyone in society is 0.7. So what's going to happen? Well, in the first step of this process, I'm buying $1 million worth of services from Sylvia in the form of building a bridge. So she's gonna, her personal, like, you know, she's gonna build $1 million worth of bridge, she's gonna get $1 million in more revenue, and that's $1 million more in society, right? It's in her pocket. What is she gonna do with that million according to this MPC of 0.7?
She's going to spend 700,000.
She's gonna go spend 700,000 at, like, maybe at, you know, one of your shops, right? So we'll say Aaron here. So Aaron has like a grocery store, and Sylvia's gonna go spend 700, or like a Walmart kind of store. You can't really spend $700,000 on groceries. But Sylvia, you can also, she's gonna pay her employees that money, right? And they'll all go spend 70% of it, right? So in some ways, that $1 million I gave Sylvia is gonna result in $700,000 of spending in other stores in the town. Aaron's grocery store and, you know, Bartek's brothel and so on. Right? So there's lots of, I had to wake you up. I had to wake you up.
What's the address?
So anyway, yeah, that always works. To make somebody, I'll just stop talking. So, this is on camera, so. All right, so Sylvia's million is going to lead to $700,000 in spending in various stores. And that money goes in the pockets of those store owners, who will then spend 70% of that, right? Which is another $490,000. So my initial million has now caused an additional 700,000, and then an additional 490,000. And then that money goes in the pockets of people, and that causes more, you know, so on down the line. And there's people saving bits of it as they go. 30% of all the money that you get in, you save. Right? But you can see clearly that my million has created more than $1 million of actual people buying stuff. How much more? The multiplier tells you, right? It's 1 divided by 1 minus 0.7, which is 1 divided by 0.3, 3.33. So my initial million to Sylvia will actually result in $3.3 billion worth of more increased economic activity. So that's the important, and then it's important to know then also that the MPC, when that goes up, what's going to happen to the government spending multiplier? Well, you can do that totally mechanically and say, look, when this thing gets bigger, we're dividing 1 by a smaller number, so this actually gets bigger. So MPC goes up, multiplier goes up. The logic of that is, I went to Sylvia with $1 million. What if she then spent 80% of it instead of 70? What if MPC was 0.8 for everyone? Then she's spending 800,000, and then the next stage is 640,000, which is bigger than 490 before, and so on. So it's just more money, like less of it's being cut away and put into savings in each stage. So there's just more total. The final point I'll make about this is that this in magnitude is smaller than this. Right? Notice that? This in magnitude, I mean ignoring the minus sign, MPC over 1 minus MPC is smaller than 1 over 1 minus MPC. Because MPC is itself probably less than 1. Right? So why is there that difference in magnitude between the two? Well, because this is a tax multiplier. And why would it be different for me to give Sylvia a $1 million tax break? Why would that be different than me giving her $1 million in government spending, like in a government contract? Why would that cause a different vertical effect? Well, let's work through the logic. I give you $1 million in tax breaks. Right? What is the first economic activity that's caused by that tax break? It's you spending $700,000. Right? That initial $1 million tax break is not itself economic activity. It's actually, I'm just saying, oh, you can keep that $1 million. I'm not saying here's $1 million for services. I'm just saying you keep your $1 million. That does not count for GDP, you keeping some of your money. But my government spending did count as GDP. I actually made you build a bridge to get that $1 million. Right? So it's going to be a smaller effect from the tax break because I'm coming to you and I'm saying you keep your $1 million and you save 30% of it right off the bat. Right? And then you spend $700,000 more in shops, and that's like step 1. So this step doesn't have that $1 million first step. So that's why this number is smaller. And actually, if you compute it, government spending multiplier versus the tax multiplier of $1 million here with 0.7, you'll find that the effect on the economy of this versus this is going to be $1 million lower here than here. And that's exactly because that first stage, there's no $1 million worth of a bridge you can build.
How do you account for policies that are permanent?